In July 1988, the Victoria Road factory fell completely silent. The assembly lines stopped. The workers were sent home. A British radio empire was sold to Amstrad for £3.1 million. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Fidelity Radio was the undisputed sovereign of the British teenage bedroom. It was the plastic portable that pulled Radio Luxembourg out of the static. It was the brand that proved a domestic manufacturer could build a radio for under £10 and flood the high street with affordable sound. But the real story of Fidelity Radio in Britain is not the 1988 factory closure. It is the story of how a nation learned to consume disposable electronics. It is the story of how the British high street demanded a price that domestic manufacturing could no longer meet, and how a company that defined affordable listening was destroyed by the very market forces it helped create. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In North Kensington, in 1946. When Jack Dickman founded Fidelity Radio Limited in 1946, the British listening market was a rigid, highly stratified arena, still deeply scarred by the economics of the Second World War. The nation had just emerged from conflict, and austerity was the defining condition of everyday life. Raw materials were fiercely rationed. Wood was scarce, metals were heavily controlled, and the domestic wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source, was still treated as a major, generational household investment. A proper sitting room radio from established names like Murphy, Bush, or Ecasio was an object of polished wood veneer or heavy dark bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive. These sets were expensive. They required months of saving. They were designed to sit permanently on a sideboard and command the attention of the entire room when the BBC Home Service was broadcast. Before Fidelity arrived, the British working-class listener, the younger family setting up a new home, or the adolescent had very few options for their own entertainment. If a household wanted a second radio for a bedroom or a cold kitchen, they often relied on pre-war hand-me-downs, home-built crystal sets assembled on kitchen tables, or ex-military surplus equipment clumsily modified for domestic mains use. What was missing was not an advancement in acoustic engineering. What was missing was a radio that was unapologetically, ruthlessly cheap. The British listener lacked a product that bypassed the snobbery of the traditional radio dealer, a set that did not demand a complex hire purchase agreement just to hear the news. The gap in the market was enormous, but the established British radio empires were too busy chasing the prestige market to notice the working-class wages waiting to be spent. Jack Dickman saw the gap. In 1946, he established his first operations at 11 Bleckenden Street, a modest address in North Kensington, London, W11. Dickman was not an acoustic purist obsessed with perfect fidelity. He was a pragmatic businessman who understood volume, margin, and the sheer pent-up demand of post-war Britain. He recognized that lower-income households did not care if a cabinet was hand-polished, so long as it could reliably tune into a national broadcaster. The company began producing basic valve radios that use glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, and quickly found a willing audience. By 1947, Fidelity introduced the Model 2546, colloquially known in the trade as the Caravan set. It was small. It was basic. It was precisely what the high street required. Records suggest that Fidelity's early strategy was entirely focused on the discount retailer. They aggressively bypassed the prestigious appointed radio dealers who sold pie and ikikyo in wood-paneled showrooms. Instead, Dickman courted the General Electrical shops, the mail-order catalogs, and the discount high street windows in working-class towns. Throughout the 1950s, the company expanded rapidly to meet the demand. The workforce grew, and the operation spilt over into the Mersey Works on Mersey Street, London W10, while maintaining the Archdale Works back on Bleckenden Street. Fidelity did not invent new broadcasting technologies, but they mastered the dark art of building to a strict, unforgiving price point. In the established British radio trade, Fidelity products earned a distinctly backhanded compliment. They were known by service engineers as all fur and no knickers, a phrase meaning they looked impressive, modern, and physically large on the outside, but utilized the absolute bare minimum required circuitry on the inside. A massive wooden cabinet might house a tiny, sparse chassis with just 3 cheap valves. But the room did not care about the trade's opinion. The signal did not care about the component count. The set either found the voice in the air, or it did not. And Fidelity sets worked well enough for the thousands of people who bought them. However, the true test of Dickman's philosophy arrived at the dawn of the 1960s. The British radio market was about to undergo a violent demographic and cultural shift. The teenager had been invented as a consumer category. Pop music was accelerating. The BBC Light program was facing fierce, illegal competition from pirate radio stations like Radio Caroline and Radio London, broadcasting from ships anchored in the North Sea. This new, younger listener did not want to sit in the front room with their parents listening to a heavy wooden radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. They wanted their own music, in their own room, out of the sight of authority. To serve this new market, Fidelity needed to abandon the hot, heavy, fragile glass valve. They needed to embrace the transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a valve. And they needed to do it cheaper than anyone else in Britain. In 1961, Fidelity Radio broke the psychological price barrier of British consumer electronics with the introduction of a single, highly compromised, but utterly revolutionary product, the Fidelity Coronet. The Coronet was a portable radio, a radio designed to be moved from room to room or taken outdoors. It did not use heavy, fragile glass components. It was a transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly. It was housed in a striking, two-tone red and white plastic cabinet, the plastic body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance. It was sold inside a cheap, imitation leather carrying pouch that smelled sharply of industrial adhesive. The physical object was a masterclass in aggressive, unapologetic cost engineering. The Coronet used 6 early transistors marked simply JB2, JB4, and JB6, soldered onto a rudimentary printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them. It operated on a single 9-volt PP9 battery, which was heavy enough to give the otherwise flimsy plastic case an illusion of substantial weight. To keep manufacturing costs brutally low, Fidelity's engineers scrutinized every single fraction of a penny. The 2 small tuning knobs on the front panel were designed with a bizarre internal spring mechanism. The user had to physically press them down into the cabinet before turning them, a cost-saving mechanical feature that was almost guaranteed to break after a few years of rough handling by an impatient teenager. Furthermore, it utilized a basic Plessey tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. In a stroke of brilliant manufacturing frugality, this capacitor also incorporated two fixed electrical contacts at the very end of its travel that acted as the waveband switch, entirely eliminating the need for a separate physical button or slide switch on the front of the cabinet. But the engineering compromises were entirely secondary to the price tag. When the Coronet launched, it achieved something that the established British radio industry had considered financially impossible. It was the very first British-made transistor radio to retail for exactly £9, 19 shillings, and sixpence. It was just under the £10 mark. Adjusted for inflation and contemporary wages, £10 in 1961 was still a significant sum, representing perhaps half a week's wages for a working-class buyer or a young apprentice. But it was a complete market revelation compared to the £15 to £20 demanded by established prestigious British brands like Bush, Roberts, or Hacker. A Roberts portable was an investment purchased by parents. A Fidelity Coronet could be saved for and bought by a teenager working a Saturday job in a local grocer. The distribution breakthrough was immediate and highly disruptive. Fidelity bypassed the snobbery of the traditional, appointed radio dealer entirely. The Coronet appeared in mail-order catalogs, in general hardware stores alongside toasters and kettles, and in high-street discount shop windows that had never previously stocked complex consumer electronics. It was also offered as a build-it-yourself kit, advertised heavily in the back pages of Practical Wireless magazine, allowing hobbyists and cash-strapped fathers to save even more money by assembling the printed circuit board on their own kitchen tables. The British radio moat, the historic defensive barrier to entry protected by high component costs, expensive wooden cabinets, appointed dealerships, and BBC-mandated audio quality standards, had been decisively breached by injection-molded plastic and aggressive high-street pricing. When a teenager opened the imitation leather pouch of a Fidelity Coronet in 1962, they were not looking for the warm, resonant bass of a heavy wooden baffle. They were looking for independence. The Coronet covered the medium wave band, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services. It also featured a clever mechanical stop to provide one preset long-wave station, a lower-frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception, tuned precisely to 1,500 meters to catch the trusted voice of the BBC Light program. The listening experience was thin, but entirely liberating. The sound left the small, stamped metal grille, the opening through which sound leaves the radio cabinet, in a highly directional, treble-heavy beam. The ferrite rod aerial, a small internal aerial often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception, was just sensitive enough to pick up the fading, wavering, exotic signal of Radio Luxembourg transmitting across the water late at night. The volume control, the knob that changes the loudness of the sound, usually crackled slightly when turned, a symptom of cheap carbon tracks wearing out against the friction of daily use. But none of that mattered to the buyer. The radio did not belong to the house. It did not belong to the parents. It belonged to the listener. Fidelity had proved a dangerous new reality to the British market. If the price was right, the British public would gladly accept plastic over wood, basic circuitry over over-engineered longevity, and immediate convenience over absolute audio fidelity. They had turned the wireless set from a piece of inherited furniture into a disposable personal accessory. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By the late 1960s, and accelerating rapidly throughout the roaring plastic consumerism of the 1970s, Fidelity Radio was operating at an industrial scale that rivaled the oldest and most respected names in British wireless manufacturing. They had entirely outgrown the cramped post-war workshops of Bletchendon Street and Mersey Street. To meet the insatiable demand of the High Street, Jack Dickman consolidated operations into a massive new factory at Olaf Street in North Kensington, before eventually expanding into a sprawling, purpose-built facility on Victoria Road in London NW10. At its absolute peak, this manufacturing complex was churning out hundreds of thousands of electronic units annually, employing a vast army of British assembly line workers, plastic molders, and logistics managers. Fidelity was no longer a small, scrappy outsider building cheap valve sets for caravans. It was a publicly quoted powerhouse on the London Stock Exchange, dictating terms to the lower half of the British electronics market. The British listening ecosystem was changing fundamentally, and Fidelity was perfectly positioned to exploit every single angle of it. Chelmsford built the idea. Droitwich carried the signal. Broadcasting House gave it a voice. The High Street sold the set. The teenage bedroom made it private. Britain made it a habit. And Fidelity made it cheap enough for every single room in the house. The company expanded relentlessly beyond the basic portable radio. They moved into record players, tape recorders, and eventually inexpensive stereo music centers, known in the trade as unit audio. The Fidelity HF42 record player, often finished in artificial wood-grain veneer or bright primary 1970s colors, became a defining staple of British youth culture. It featured a basic, mass-produced turntable mechanism made by BSR in Birmingham, a simple solid-state amplifier, and a single loudspeaker, the part of a radio or audio system that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air. It was not high fidelity, despite the bold, optimistic letters printed on the plastic lid. But it was affordable, and it allowed an entire generation to play the latest singles away from the critical ears of their parents. Alongside the record players, the RAD series of portable radios dominated the market. Beginning with the immensely popular RAD 11 in 1967 and evolving through the RAD 12, RAD 15, and beyond, these sets conquered the budget shelves of the British retail landscape. This was a triumph not just of manufacturing, but of distribution. Fidelity radios filled the pages of the newly launched Argos catalogs. They were stacked high in the windows of Currys and Dixons. They were a cornerstone of the co-op electrical departments across the industrial North and the Midlands. Fidelity understood that the high street retailer did not want to sell a complicated, expensive radio to a casual buyer. The retailer wanted a brightly colored, cleanly packaged box that could be handed over a counter in exchange for a few pound notes. Every morning, fleets of delivery lorries left the Victoria Road factory, moving constantly between the London production lines and the massive regional distribution warehouses of the high street chains. This was the Fidelity peak. The defining British cultural moment for the brand was not a prestigious royal warrant, a highly classified military communications contract, or a celebrated engineering partnership with the BBC. It was absolute, inescapable ubiquity. In a typical 1974 British household, the rigid hierarchy of domestic electronics was clear. Downstairs in the sitting room, the main color television might have been a rented rediffusion or radio rental set, guarded carefully by the adults. The main hi-fi system in the corner might have been a prestigious Pi, an older radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, or a Japanese stereo import. But upstairs, in the bedrooms, the territory belonged entirely to Fidelity. A teenager's Fidelity RAD portable radio was a sensory object of its era. The plastic cabinets, often molded in striking blue, red, or stark white, smelled faintly of warm printed circuit boards, carbon resistors, and settling dust. The tuning dials, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, were wide, brightly colored, clearly marked, and unapologetically modern. They were constantly tuned to 247 meters on the medium wave band to catch the newly launched BBC Radio 1, which had replaced the offshore pirate stations. The chrome trim on the speaker grille and the handle was usually plastic, coated in a microscopic, fragile layer of metal, highly prone to bubbling and flaking off after a few years of heavy use by a careless adolescent. These radios were disposable in a way that previous British wireless sets simply were not. This marked a profound shift in British consumer culture. If a 1950s EKTO or Murphy valve radio broke down, it was carefully carried to the local high street repair shop to have a faulty capacitor, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, replaced by a trained service engineer armed with a soldering iron and a schematic diagram. The set was an investment to be maintained. If a 1975 Fidelity Rad portable stopped working, it was rarely repaired. The labor cost of the high street engineer often exceeded the residual value of the radio itself. Instead, the broken set was thrown into the dustbin, and the listener simply walked to the high street, opened the Autumn Argos catalog, and purchased a slightly newer, slightly cheaper replacement. Yet, for Jack Dickman and his board of directors, this emerging replacement culture was massively profitable. They had successfully navigated the transition from valves to transistors and from mono listening to stereo bedrooms. They had even achieved enough industrial scale and manufacturing reliability to briefly produce television sets under the prestigious licensed HMV brand name in the late 1970s. They had survived the initial terrifying wave of Japanese transistor imports by keeping their margins razor-thin, their cabinet designs strictly aligned with British tastes, and their high-street distribution networks ruthlessly, efficiently locked down. They provided exactly what the market demanded, at exactly the price the market was willing to pay. Every catalog, every discount window, every teenager's bedroom. For nearly 4 decades, Fidelity Radio proved that a British factory could build electronics for the masses. They had conquered the high street and democratized the listening habit. But the economic ground beneath the massive Victoria Road factory was already shifting. The retail market that Fidelity had mastered was evolving into a global supply chain, and it was about to punish the company for its total reliance on price above all else. The decline of Fidelity Radio was not caused by a single catastrophic engineering failure, a massive product recall, or a sudden loss of public interest in the wireless set. It was the result of a slow, crushing vice created by overlapping structural market forces, arriving in sequence, leaving a domestic British manufacturer with nowhere left to hide. The British turning point arrived in 1982. Jack Dickman, the formidable founder who had built the company from a single room in North Kensington into a high-street manufacturing empire, died. Control of the business subsequently passed to his 3 sons. They inherited a company that looked incredibly successful on paper, but was fundamentally structurally unsound for the ruthless, globalized decade that was about to unfold. The protective barriers that had once insulated British consumer electronics from the rest of the world were rapidly dissolving. Force 1, British cabinet, valve, transistor, component, labor and manufacturing costs, struck the Victoria Road operation first, and it struck relentlessly. By the early 1980s, the financial reality of running a massive, labor-intensive electronics assembly plant in London was becoming entirely unsustainable. The strong value of the British pound severely hampered export opportunities, making domestic manufacturing brutally expensive compared to overseas rivals. British radios required cabinets, plastic molding, transistors, loudspeakers, tuning dials, aerials, printed circuit boards, testing, packaging, shipping, and skilled domestic labor. In the 1960s, Fidelity had won the high street by controlling all of these costs locally. But by 1983, the wages required to employ hundreds of London assembly workers simply could not be absorbed into a plastic portable radio that still needed to retail for under £15 in a discount catalogue. The overheads of the Victoria Road factory, the electricity to run the heavy plastic injection molding machines, the local property rates, the distribution fleets, were eating directly into margins that were already razor-thin. A radio could still tune beautifully into the BBC and still lose the shop shelf because the plastic cabinet cost too much to press. Force 4. Imports, private labels, and good enough listening. Then broke the company's defining historic advantage. Fidelity had always survived and thrived by being the absolute cheapest viable option on the high street. If you had limited funds, you bought a Fidelity. But in the 1980s, a tidal wave of cheap imports from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and a rapidly industrializing China began flooding the UK consumer market. The British retail landscape shifted violently. Supermarkets, high street discount chains, and even the mighty Argos catalog began sourcing unbranded or private label electronics directly from factories in East Asia. A generic, Hong Kong-made clock radio, a small radio combined with an alarm clock, often used beside a bed, could be manufactured, boxed, loaded onto a container ship, landed at a British port, and delivered to a retail warehouse for less than it cost Fidelity just to source the internal components in London. The cheaper imported radio did not need to last for decades. It did not need to be a masterpiece of electronic longevity. It only needed to find BBC Radio 2 in the kitchen, or play a cassette tape loudly in a bedroom. The British buyer, who Fidelity had carefully trained to value immediate price over long-term repairability, happily abandoned the domestic brand for the imported alternative. The retreat began quietly, behind the scenes of the annual product brochures. To survive the price war, Fidelity attempted to offshore some of their own production. They began importing Far Eastern electronics and placing their own badge on the plastic. The Fidelity RAD 30 portable radio, introduced to the British market in the early 1980s, was entirely manufactured in Hong Kong for Fidelity Radio Limited. The assembly lines at Victoria Road were scaled back, but this offshoring strategy was a temporary bandage, not a systemic cure. If Fidelity was simply importing generic Asian radios and applying their own badge, they offered no unique value to the giant retailers. The purchasing managers at Curry's or Dixon's did not need Fidelity to buy radios from Hong Kong on their behalf. The retailers could buy them directly, cutting out the London middleman entirely and keeping the margin for themselves. The brand lost its position on the high street. The catalog dropped the weaker product lines. The listener community, now distracted by the Sony Walkman, Japanese twin cassette boomboxes, and early home computers, moved on without looking back. Profits at Fidelity began to fall rapidly. The company had previously moved heavily into the budget television and audio separates market to compensate, surviving as an unspectacular but steady setmaker. But the profit margins there were also collapsing as imported Japanese and Korean televisions grew larger, vastly more reliable, and aggressively cheaper. In 1984, the struggling, heavily indebted company was bought for £14 million by Caparo Industries, a massive Anglo-Indian steel and engineering conglomerate. Caparo saw a turnaround investment opportunity. They believed they could stem the financial losses, modernize the aging Victoria Road factory, and force the Fidelity brand to move upmarket. escaping the brutal, margin-crushing price war at the absolute bottom of the catalog page. It was a fatal, terminal misreading of Force 3, high street retail, rental chains, catalogs, and online price pressure. The British public did not view Fidelity as an upmarket brand. They viewed it as the brand you bought when you could not afford a Panasonic, a Sony, or a Hacker. The high street electrical shops, point blank, refused to stock Fidelity products at premium prices, knowing their customers would never pay a premium for that specific badge. The brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity, was already absolute and irreversible. A teenager in 1985 did not want a Fidelity stereo system, they wanted Japanese electronics. For 4 exhausting years, Caparo poured millions of pounds into the Victoria Road operation, trying desperately to compete against a new wave of cheap, small-screen televisions, portable audio equipment, and imported hi-fi systems. But the market had changed its rules. Import duties had been steadily cut by the British government as part of global trade agreements, removing the very last layer of artificial protection for domestic electronics manufacturing. By the spring of 1988, the board of Caparo realized they could not stop the financial bleeding. The high value of the pound, the heavy cost of London labor, and the absolute terrifying dominance of Asian electronics imports made the Fidelity factory a financial black hole that threatened to drag down the wider conglomerate. The final British chapter was executed with brutal, unsentimental corporate efficiency. In May 1988, Caparo sold the Fidelity brand name, the remaining inventory, and the trademark to Amstrad, the aggressive electronics empire run by Alan Sugar, for a mere £3.1 million. Alan Sugar did not want the factory. He did not want the workers. He did not want the London assembly lines, the aging plastic molding machines, the repair benches, or the post-war heritage of Jack Dickman. He only wanted the name. He wanted a familiar British badge to stick onto cheap televideos, budget audio systems, and imported televisions that he was already aggressively sourcing from Asia. At the end of July 1988, Caparo formally closed the Victoria Road factory for good. The physical infrastructure of a massive 40-year British radio empire was dismantled and erased in a matter of weeks. The assembly workers, many of whom had spent their entire adult lives building radios for the British High Street, were permanently laid off. The circuit board machinery was sold for scrap metal or exported. The complex plastic injection molds were destroyed. The service manuals, the detailed schematic books used by local repairmen to keep older radios working, were thrown into industrial dumpsters. The spare parts inventory was liquidated. The British supply chain fractured. The manufacturing stopped. The high street moved on. As the final summer weeks of 1988 passed, the physical reality of the company simply evaporated. The massive building was emptied. The tools were sold. The delivery lorries were reassigned. The repair counter closed. The catalog dropped the set. The factory fell silent. The badge moved overseas. The dial stopped glowing. The imported television answered instead. Following the brutal 1988 collapse, the Fidelity brand experienced a grim, protracted afterlife. Under Amstrad's ownership throughout the 1990s, the name was resurrected and slapped indiscriminately onto a massive volume of budget televisions and combined TV video cassette units. Some were dual-branded as Amstrad Fidelity. They had absolutely no engineering, design, or spiritual connection to Jack Dickman's original company in North Kensington. The name was simply a convenient, licensed skin used to sell heavily commoditized technology. By the late 1990s, the name had been sold yet again, becoming nothing more than a generic badge applied to the absolute cheapest imported televisions sold in the aisles of British supermarkets. The brand dilution was complete and total. Eventually, the name simply went dormant, vanishing entirely from the British High Street and the Argos catalogue pages it had once utterly dominated. Today, the original Fidelity Radio Limited exists solely in the realm of the British secondary market and enthusiast memory. On eBay, Gumtree, and Facebook Marketplace, the brightly colored Fidelity Coronets and the artificial wood grain. HF-42 record players routinely surface in varying states of decay. They are discussed on vintage radio forums and repaired by amateur radio clubs. Collectors of 1960s and 1970s pop culture seek them out not for their audio quality, which remains decidedly thin, but for their aesthetic perfection as physical objects of their era. An old British Fidelity radio with a repaired capacitor, a cleaned tuning dial, and a small speaker still pushing air can do something a modern smart speaker often cannot: make listening feel attached to a specific place and time. Not because it was an engineering marvel, because the physical act of tuning it still asks the listener to meet the crackling, imperfect signal halfway, just as an entire generation did in their teenage bedrooms. The physical sites of the empire are gone. The Bleckenden Street and Mersey Street works have been swallowed by the relentless, expensive gentrification of West London. The massive Victoria Road factory in NW10 has long since been demolished, replaced by modern industrial parks, data centers, and vast logistics sheds. There is no blue plaque for Jack Dickman. There is no museum for the cheap plastic portable. Yet, there is a surprise footnote in the surviving record. Among serious radio collectors and restoration experts today, the 1961 Fidelity Coronet, once completely derided by the established trade as a cheap, disposable plastic gimmick, is now highly prized. The very fragility of its cost-cutting construction means remarkably few have survived intact. The cheap plastic tuning knobs that required pressing to turn are almost always broken or missing. Therefore, an intact, fully working Coronet today commands a price far higher, relatively speaking, than it ever did in the dusty window of a 1960s discount hardware shop. The story of Fidelity Radio reveals a harsh, uncomfortable truth about how Britain builds, sells, hears, remembers, and discards voices. It shows the massive gap between what Britain says it values: trust, repairability, public service, and honest engineering, and what the market actively rewards: absolute price, immediate convenience, and relentless novelty. Fidelity gave the British public exactly what they asked for: cheap, disposable access to the voices in the air. When the public eventually found someone else on the other side of the world to do it cheaper, they abandoned the domestic brand without a second thought. But the objects themselves refused to entirely disappear. Somewhere in Britain tonight, a battered RAD-11 portable is still sitting on a cold workshop shelf, its plastic case heavily faded, its tuning dial dark, waiting for a hand to turn the volume knob and find one more voice in the air. See you in the next one.